Thanks very much, everyone. I'll try and keep us moving on time. My name is Richard Wilson. I'm Senior Vice President and Primary Focus Lead of Genetic Regulation at Astellas. Basically, that's internal code for being our TA head for our AAV gene therapy business, where I have accountability for our long-term strategy, planning, and execution. I'm also an ARM board member as of January. I want to give a big shout out to the organizing committee and a plug for those of you who is maybe on the fence. Please join ARM. This is the usual statement to say I'm talking to you as an employee of Astellas. Let's get to the discussion here. I think we've all seen a variation of these numbers. I think Tim did a fantastic job at the start of the session yesterday, laying out the groundwork for where we are at this moment in time. And I feel as though this is a really interesting moment. We saw a whole spate of approvals in the last year. Just to look at a few: hemophilia, DMD, we saw sickle cell, beta thalassemia, and metachromatic leukodystrophy. And that's not everything in the last 12 months. And you look even further back and think about the number of programs in the pipeline, almost 2,000 open INDs in cell and gene therapy. That to me says that we're at the beginning of a wave. And it's hard not to look at what we've been hearing about today and yesterday and not conclude, like, we've got to work together to work out how to be ready for this, because this is coming. And, you know, at Astellas, we see ourselves very much in that mix. It's also important to acknowledge the partnership we're seeing from various bodies around the world, and, you know, calling out especially the collaboration we're seeing from the FDA under Peter Marks and Nicole Verdun. So within Astellas, we're looking to build an end-to-end gene therapy business across research, across development, manufacturing, and commercial. Across the entire organization, we're really focused on being forward-looking. We're very keen at innovating and investing in new innovations. And really, it's led from the top by our CEO, Naoki Okamura, with a philosophy that what got us here won't get us there. And cell and gene therapy is very much a part of our plans for the future. Some of that is based on topics such as our focus area approach. I lead one of our 5 focus areas within Astellas. It's a way of looking at the pharmaceutical landscape, where we try and identify new modalities that we think we can have purchase on, known biology that has a direct correlation with the etiology of diseases we're interested in, and then a significant unmet need where those 2 other things can be brought to bear. That also implies we made investments in a range of transformative platforms. My area, such as AAV, we've also built pipelines looking at universal donor cells and iPSCs. So we've got a range of things on the stove at the moment. And importantly, we've been looking to put our money where our mouth is and make substantial investments in facilities and capabilities that will allow us to bring those technologies forward. So as I think about the areas that I'm accountable for in AAV gene therapy, our mission is pretty straightforward: discover, develop, and deliver, especially that last part is important, breakthrough therapies with life-changing value for patients who have few options. I think that can resonate with everyone here. I won't run through the whole pipeline. This is a snapshot of some of our AAV programs that we've disclosed publicly. In the light salmon color, you can see our development programs. AT132, that is a gene transfer for X-linked myotubular myopathy. I'll talk a little bit about some of the new data we published late last year in that program. AT845, which is in a phase 1/2, the Fortis study for Pompe disease. We talked a little bit about that at the meeting on the Mesa last year and just released some pretty interesting longer-term data where we see good durability of response in patients at least 2 years post-dosing. And we have A2016, which is a Friedreich's ataxia focused program looking at delivering the gene for frataxin to address the cardiomyopathy associated with Friedreich's. The other point I want to make on this slide is the importance of collaborations and working with others. I think that's, again, a theme I pick up a lot in meetings like this. I want to call out our license agreement we signed with Kate Therapeutics, bringing new capsid technology to bear on XLMTM, and then the option agreement we put in place with Taysha Gene Therapies around their AAV9 program for Rett syndrome that's also in a phase 1/2. This slide's really meant to try and tell a little bit about our philosophical story. I think that we talk a lot about the problems of today's gene therapy and the challenges, and we'll certainly get into some of that in a moment. But I think as well, there's a tendency in the field we've seen where we'll run into a problem, we'll try and come up with a scientific or an engineering solution. We'll skip over and we'll go to a different modality, or maybe skip to a different disease, or we're just going to focus on larger opportunities. And at Astellas, we feel that's not an either or, we think it's an and. We very much we have the bull case around the long-term potential for AAV. We think that this technology ultimately will find its home in much more common diseases over the next decade. But in order to do that, we have to keep the promises we have in the rare and the ultra-rare populations today and really see through what we see into potential for our current generation of therapies. If you think about just the sheer number of issues we've been discussing at this meeting in the last 2 days, you can check off the list all the different things that we're going to need to optimize to get to that future state. There's going to be manufacturing efficiency. There's going to be lower doses. There's going to be making more doses. There's going to be looking at how do we frame risk-benefit situations in chronic diseases. Are regulators ready? Where are payers going to be on this? What does pricing look like? All of those things have to come together in order to be successful. And we think that being successful first in those smaller rare to ultra-rare populations is going to predispose to success over the long haul. Briefly, a note on infrastructure investments. What you see here is a very small depiction of 3 key research and manufacturing centers we have. Our original AAV facility in Tsukuba, Japan. We see at the bottom a brand new facility we just opened in South San Francisco, which houses our research and technical operations, non-GMP, and process development teams. And then a Sanford, North Carolina GMP facility we opened up in 2022 with 135,000 square foot of space and is actively being used to make clinical material for us at the moment. So we feel very good about the facilities. You can't ignore the need to bring in the expertise that goes along with that, and also the vision to think about how do we start to iterate towards that future state. And again, we're looking at next generation process improvements that we see already as yielding improved productivity per batch. We're seeing good product purity and quality attributes, including things like full, partial, empty ratios. We're seeing that across multiple constructs and different serotypes of AAV. And importantly, we're starting to see a really strong case for reduced cost of goods. So we think those are good leading indicators for where we want to be and where we think the field needs to move. So I want to change topic a little bit and share some of the update I mentioned earlier on of data we published in the Lancet Neurology on AT132 for X-linked myotubular myopathy. For those who are less familiar, XLMTM, as it's called, is a very serious life-threatening neuromuscular disease. It affects approximately 1 in 50,000 males. The majority of those, about 80%, display a very serious phenotype, which results in a presentation of breathing problems and inability to breathe unassisted. There's a strong degree of hypertonia. These babies appear floppy, and ultimately they also have difficulty feeding themselves. Tragically, about 50% of those kids with that severe phenotype don't see their 18th month, and those that do survive are basically relying on respiratory care, wheelchair-bound, and often need assistance with feeding. It's caused by a defect in the gene MTM1 that is responsible for producing myotubularin. It's a protein that's critical, as it turns out, for healthy muscle structure and function. As you can see from the cartoon, where you don't have adequate myotubularin, we get a much more reduced density of myofilaments in myocytes, and interestingly, the nuclei are no longer peripherally located, but become centrally located, which is a hallmark of the histopathology of the disease. So 8132, it's worth calling out as well. It's in itself an example of partnership in our sector. I know we've got some colleagues out here from Genathon who were involved in the program earlier on, through Audentes, the company I joined, and now Astellas. You know, it's rare that we see a program that starts with a single group who takes it from start to finish. But it's an MTM1, a full-length MTM1 gene, controlled by a desmin promoter to be active in skeletal muscle, delivered in an AAV8 capsid. So we studied that in the Aspiro open-label study. It's a phase 1/2 study you may have heard of already, where we looked at 24 treated boys and compared that to a delayed treatment group and some untreated patients from the Inceptus registry study, where we looked for the impact of 8132 on respiratory outcomes. And we were gratified and somewhat surprised to see the initial primary endpoint was to look at the reduction in hours of daily respiratory support at 24 weeks. However, what we found was 2/3 of the children stopped needing any ventilator support entirely. You can see the two treatment arms in red and blue relative to the control group on the right. It's a bit of an eye chart, so I don't expect you to read it, but hopefully what you can see is the separation of respiratory response over time. The one thing that's really important to note about this study is that there was a change in the protocol between the high and the low dose group. So the high dose patients look like they've seen less effect. They actually had a much more conservative weaning protocol to take them off of the ventilator. So there was some additional factors that are responsible for some of the differences we see between the treatment arms. As we think about motor milestones, we've seen a continued trend here. When we think about what milestones as your parents expect to see your children hit, the ability to sit unassisted, only 5 patients in the control group could sit on their own without falling over for 30 seconds, whereas we saw 20 patients in the treated group. When we look beyond that, we see 12 patients were able to pull themselves to a stand, and 8 were able to achieve the ability to walk independently, which, suffice to say, is something that's incredibly unusual to see in patients with XLNTM, as witnessed by the fact none of the control patients saw any of those motor milestones. We also see positive trends in inspiratory pressure, which is a measure, obviously, of muscle strength in the lungs. It's also, we saw an improvement in CHOP intend, which speaks to motor function, as well as ASCEND and the PEDS QLNM, which address the caregiver and patient quality of life scores. So we saw positive impacts in all of these that we think were incredibly encouraging. Of course, I think most people are aware, we also had some challenges with safety in this study. The Aspiro study itself is currently on clinical hold after we saw 4 patient deaths, which we believe were treatment-related, 3 in the high-dose group and 1 in the low-dose group, where we saw a development of a hepatobiliary effect that ultimately resulted in liver failure. It's worth noting all the participants in the study, whether they were treated or untreated, experienced an adverse event, the majority of which was serious, which I think is the first clue that we see this as an incredibly fragile patient population that we were dealing with. What we committed to do for the study from the FDA was to first look at what non-clinical information could we gather to try and understand the biological mechanism behind these safety events, and we worked with other sponsors to try and dig into that. What would we do to maybe think about any improvements we could make to CMC, to manufacturing process, just to rule out any other impurities that might be associated with these outcomes? And then also, what would we change in our protocol going forward? And we're still actively pushing all of those pieces forward. But as we look forward into the future, we've already found that there's a strong and previously underappreciated incidence of a cholestatic tendency that presents in XLNTM. Sadly, that story of once you develop a treatment, you learn a lot more about the disease as you're developing the treatment for that disease. We've also been able to find opportunities to branch out and look at partnerships, such as with Kate Therapeutics. We're currently studying and progressing through non-clinical a myoAAV version of 8132, which we believe is going to be allowed us to hopefully see the kind of benefits that we've seen on the other slides at a far decreased dose. And importantly, we've also made a point to say we are committed to sharing those findings because we're all in this together, right? We know that no one program that experiences a success or a problem does that in isolation. We all have to learn from each other. So I want to maybe close out with a commitment that, please take away. We're committed to rare disease. We think we have to go through the rare and ultra-rare populations to ultimately be successful. We're committed to the community with XLMTM. And I think the other thing I want to throw in is we've just kicked off a new observational study called Excel, where we plan to generate the most robust and complete picture of liver health in boys with XLMTM. So please stay tuned for more updates on that. I will skip the comment about partnering and just highlight how important collaboration is to us at Astellas. And importantly, it's all about what we can do, what we owe to these patient populations to really deliver on the promise of AAV. Thank you.